topic is unavoidable. It is the Italian election, of course. And what I might say is the most rather classic example of the old cliche, buy the rumor and sell the fact. Let's just take a look and get started here. It's been a very interesting election year, shall we say. Britain in June, the United States in November, Italy in December, and also Austria, although less so. So we won't talk about that too much today. And there is a theme here. It is most assuredly distrust, and I would say, if not disgust, from the great majority of voters. In the Italian case today, the market reaction was minimal. Now we have a question. Is that because the vote itself wasn't important and the decision made in the vote was unimportant, or because it was, for once, correctly predicted and played out in the polls, at least, and in the actual vote almost exactly as expected? I think we all know the answer to that one. Of course, we have an example in front of us where the polls are actually right. I mean, running into the election, we're running into this vote, the polls are about 53, 58% no. In fact, it came out 60-40 against. And just so everyone remembers, 60% in any type of election in a democracy is a huge vote. Huge. So as somebody said, this is a lot more than a no vote. It is a, well, he used a word we don't say in public, or at least on the media, but it's definitely a strong no vote. So what is going on here? It seemed on the face of it that the Italian constitutional referendum that was, reform that was proposed by Matteo Renzi was a good idea. And the Italians have had 63 governments in the Second World War. That's a little bit more than 70 years. 71 years. That's not political stability. That is certainly, at least not by as we would define it here in the West or in the United States. And it makes things very difficult to get things done. So this would have streamlined that. It would have given more power to the central government to affect the makeup of the upper house and the Senate, and that would have permitted all sorts of reforms to go through with a much greater ease. There's also another reform which is now being debated, and that was the awarding of 340 legislative seats to any party which scores 40% of the vote. They're now talking about rescinding that, but that's another topic. So how is this in line with the other votes? Just so we know what we're talking about here, this is the euro minute to minute this morning. I put a few things up last night when the euro was right about here. And what we can see is that Asia did very, very little. Who brought the euro up? Obviously the Europeans. It's a little bit higher than where it got to where it closed. It closed at 106.70, if I remember. So it's higher than that. But this is not a judgment on European politics going forward. This is a judgment on market positioning. And that's all it is. Once it becomes clear that a vote, regardless of its actual long-term effect on the euro or on the markets, is not going to drive the markets anymore in that direction immediately, then you will get a reversal. This is just buy the rumor and sell a fact. Or in this case, sell the rumor and buy the fact. But classic example of it for markets. But it doesn't tell us anything about European and Italian politics going forward. So let us now consider the actual electoral and political process that is likely to take place in Europe and certainly in Italy, and then discuss one of the reasons. Well, let's do it this way. Let's reverse the process. Clearly, this vote means something. Italians, as voters, are not happy at all. And we have to examine why before we then examine what likely will happen. Politics responds more forcefully than anything else to economic circumstances. It's been true as long as people have been voting. And what are the circumstances in Italy that have fostered this type of resentment and anger at the political establishment? Because that's what we're seeing. There's no question that this vote is not to use a cliche, but a wake-up call, or at least a enormous piece of criticism for the Italian government, the Italian way of doing things. Excuse me. The basic fact of Italy and its economy is that the economy has grown not a bit since the euro was instituted. This vote, although it will never, the interesting thing about, many interesting things, but let's just take one small fact. The party that is likely to benefit from this, literally they don't call themselves a party, Beppe Grillo's five-star movement, is anti-euro. Not EU, but anti-euro. They think Italy should leave the euro, such as they have a political philosophy. If anyone stands to benefit from this, if they run a good campaign, it will be the five-star movement. But if you poll Italy, or at least you poll Italians, at least in the past, the numbers that want to leave the euro are maybe 20%. So how is this, do these two things make sense? There's a huge vote essentially against the established way of doing things. Against Italy's economic performance, against party priorities. You could say it's against corruption. Remember the two prime ministers ago had Silvio Berlusconi. We had all of the disgust in the Italian electorate directed at the establishment. Now remember, when this vote was first proposed, the support for it, I mean, it's quite some time ago, was somewhere around 60%. But then Matteo Renzi said he'd resign if it doesn't pass. And when he did that, it transformed the vote from a rather dry and probably sensible, at least from an efficiency point of view, governmental reform to a vote on the economic performance and the political establishment as a whole. That is an interesting transformation, because were there not sufficient resentment and anger, that would never have taken place. The parallels to Brexit and the election of Donald Trump are very strong. The Italians say that they don't want to leave the euro, or have in the past anyway, yet they vote in a referendum which makes it much more possible than it ever was before. I'm not saying it's going to happen, but much more possible. Clearly, the markets are not worried about this anytime soon, and we'll talk about why that is in a second. In the United States, you have large numbers of voters voting for a candidate who has no political experience whatsoever. And in England, you have large numbers of voters voting against the political practice and economic practice of a generation. These are votes that tell you that something is stirring in the world's electorates, at least electorates that can vote. So the Italians have said, no, we need to change. What the change is, nobody knows. In the United States, people vote for Trump. What is he going to do? Well, we don't really know. Same with Britain. But all of these votes are voting against the political practice, the international economic practice, one might say malpractice in many cases, of a generation, or in the Italians' case, half a generation, 16 years for the euro. So why is that the case? Now, last week, in the webinar last week, I spoke about why the Italians are clearly unhappy with what's going on in Italy. And I looked at GDP and I looked at unemployment. GDP, as I said, depending on your measure, is either flat or down 0.8% in 15 years since the advent of the euro. Unemployment is actually rising, and it's over 11.7, I think, was up in September. Youth unemployment is 40%. That's a crime against a generation. I think, as I said, you're creating a lost generation of people who will have passed through their early years of adulthood and never have had a full-time job. Those are habits that become ingrained and are hardly good for the economy or the individual. As William Faulkner said, the only thing we can do 8 hours a day is work. We can't eat, we can't exercise. He didn't say exercise, and a few other things. So the purpose of this vote is emotional rather than practical. How do we? So we know some of the reasons why things are unhappy in Italy. We look at the markets. Here is the euro, as I told you, 5 minutes recovered into Europe. We can take a look at all sorts of equities. This is the Italian equities here. The UK is yellow. The German DAX is green. And the CAC. The Italians are essentially flat. Everybody else has gone up. Take a look at sovereign debt. This is probably the most telling European sovereign debt of all of them, with Japan in there just as a sort of reminder of where an alternative reality exists. So the Italian is in white, Portugal in purple, US in green, and Germany is in yellow. And what is most interesting about this? Well, two things. One, that the rates are all moving in tandem, more or less. Not as much for Germany and Japan. Nonetheless, the move that you're seeing higher in sovereign rates in Italy is not really a judgment on the Italian referendum. It's not a judgment on the euro. It's not a judgment on Italy leaving the European Union. It is one with the world's movement higher in interest rates, probably led primarily by the United States, partially by the Fed, but mostly apparently by the election of Donald Trump. Whatever you want to say about that as far as other topics go. So if you're looking at the credit markets, now The Italian banks and Italian finance sector is in much worse condition. That's true. But if you're looking just at the sovereign debt credit markets, you're not seeing fear. You're not seeing a collapse of the euro. You're not seeing a threat to the EU. This is important because the view and much of the hyperbolic write-ups before this was that the euro's on the ropes as soon as Renzi loses the election. That's not remotely true. Okay, so let's take a step back and discuss, because the market's going to be responding for the next couple of months to Italian political developments. European markets, certainly. If it looks as if the five-star movement is swaying the Italian populace to leave the euro, then you will get a reaction. But first of all, let's take a look at what's likely to happen. Renzi resigned. There's going to be some sort of caretaker government. One of the scenarios that was discussed in the media was, snap elections. They'll have elections in 2 weeks or something. That's not happening. So what you're going to get is a caretaker government, most likely with the finance minister, that will be named by the president, and he will be running the show for a while. And then they do have to have new elections. But clearly they're not going to have them this year. And my guess is they won't have them until the second quarter of next year at the earliest. So everybody can go back to worrying about their Christmas menu and putting up the tree and anything else that you want to do in the Western world and in Western Europe to celebrate the coming of the Christmas holidays. So that immediate reaction is out of there. Now, two other things are important before we talk about how this might play out. The first is that the Italians recently passed a law that I alluded to earlier. It was sponsored by Renzi because he thought he'd benefit from it, his government would benefit from it. It awards 340 legislative seats to a party that gets 40% of the vote. The goal of this is to permit majority rule. When you have proportional representation, everybody gets a certain number of seats in the legislature depending on how many votes they actually got above a certain threshold in the election. Well, that makes for very good representation, but it makes for really lousy government because coalitions become difficult or impossible. In order to corral people into a coalition government, everybody has to be served. Everybody can make demands. If you're a tiny little party with those last 3 votes that form the government, then the government's got to promise you something. So it makes governing very difficult. So this reform of 340 votes, legislative seats awarded to the United States, to people in the United States, seems strange. But we don't have proportional representation. We have winner take all. And it's not even for the presidency a direct vote. It's the vote by state. Because although it doesn't appear that way, the federal government is, in its origin and in the Constitution, a creation of the states. Remember, after the revolution and the victory, there was no federal government. There were only state governments, colonial governments formerly. And it was the sovereign states that formed and created the federal government, not the other way around. Washington and DC government is a creation of the states. So the power flows upward, granted in part and transferred to the federal government. It is not devolved from an all-powerful central government, devolved onto the states. It's a very different concept. So that's where the origin of the electoral vote came from and how it's used to elect the presidency. So back to Italy. So in Italy, they passed this law, electoral reform. But now they're having second thoughts. At least the current power structure is having second thoughts. Why? Well, because Rienzi's center-left party, which is called Democratic something, the name escapes me at the moment, sorry, is running about tied in the polls with the Five-Star Movement. Well, aside from the normal drive to retain power, which is natural to any political party, any politician, the Five-Star Movement has some very anti-establishment, anti-globalist, anti-Euro, and perhaps even anti-EU strains. So now that this law, now you can see why the Italians are distrustful and voted so heavily in this vote. As I said before, 60-40 is a huge defeat for Rienzi and the globalists and the Europeanists. So now that the political evolution in Italy has taken a different turn, the establishment that wanted this reform is now trying to get rid of it. I think they're dragging it through the courts to see if the courts, and I don't know exactly how the Italian court system works. It's different in the United States, I know. But there's a good chance, apparently, that some Italian court or other will declare this unconstitutional. But this feeds exactly into the Five-Star narrative that the government and the establishment is corrupt and in league and cahoots with all the other, corrupt and establishment countries around the world. I'm not repeating this as fact. I'm simply talking about a movement in Italy that has a good chance of being very successful in the next election. So now that it's not going to serve their purpose, the establishment in Italy is trying to get rid of this reform, which they simply supported prior. What does this do? Well, of course, this feeds in to the suspicion, which actually seems justified in this case, that the Italian government has only interested in its own power. Because what would happen? As I said, the current polling, I believe, is about 30-30 for the Five-Star Movement and Rienzi's center-left party. But the Five-Star Movement has never really, it's a very new movement, it's 7 years, has never really competed in a national election in the sense that they stand a chance, or a possibility at least, of winning. So what could happen if this law is not amended or gotten rid of? Then it is conceivable. I'm not saying problems, I'm saying conceivable, well within the realm of possibility. After this election, after the huge vote against the establishment, there's no other way to interpret this vote. After the shenanigans that are now taking place to try and get rid of this 40% rule simply because it no longer benefits the party in power, it could benefit the Five-Star Movement. You put those things together with the potential for movement, for the Five-Star Movement. And I would bet two things. One, that the current polling needs to be, shall we say, redone. If you really do move to a campaign, a national campaign, which you will at some point, and Five Star is going to run. If you move to a campaign with the old center-left and other parties, the right party is Sforza Italia, I think, Berlusconi's party, against Five Star, I would start betting that you're going to get some pretty serious movement to the Five Star vote. As I said, the shenanigans of trying to get rid of this reform, which you just put in, only reinforces their narrative. I would also bet that once the argument starts to take place, the argument about the euro, the polling that I quoted earlier, where only 15 or 20% of the Italians thought that they should leave the euro, that's an old statistic. The argument has never really been presented or taken place. It's like the Brexit argument in Britain. The argument had never been presented in a coherent form by competent, eloquent spokesman before. No doubt Cameron, as far as the departure goes, made a mistake. Well, it looks like Rienzi made the same mistake. It's like Mrs. Clinton in the United States made similar mistakes about assuming where political strength actually lies in the electorate and what people are actually thinking. So the idea, or the polling, that the 20% is an antiquated, meaning old as far as the polling goes, opinion. Once a national campaign starts to heat up, and arguments are made and evidence presented and debates incurred about the euro, the most prominent, the most substantive of the five-star ideas is about the euro. They want to put the euro to a referendum. That's what they've said. They've said it so many times and it's been so prominent that it's going to be very difficult for the movement and its candidates to pull back on that. So they're going to have a discussion in one of the central countries of the European Monetary Union about the successes and failures of that union in Italy. It sounds to me that this is what democracy is all about. And what might some of the debates be? Well, that's difficult because they don't know how coherent on substantive topics rather than just being anti-something, anti-globalist, anti-this, anti-that, and whether they have a competent spokesman or spokespeople, men and women, to put forth this view. But the economic facts are difficult to gainsay and are very much in favor of some of the arguments that, supportive, if you will, that the five-star movement has made and I'm assuming will make in the run-up to any national. Italy has never had a discussion about the euro. They are about to. And if we've seen a recovery to status quo this morning in the euro and in European stocks and everything else, it's simply because that discussion didn't take place. Meaning the actual events of the next 6 months are not going to be dramatic. They are not going to, as far as things that we know about today, they're not going to be the type of actions. They're going to get a caretaker government and they're going to plod on for a while. And they'll have to work out, have that election. Now, it's of course, the Italian establishment that is calling the elections. And to be sure, their main concern is going to be how to keep the five-star movement out of power. So the market response is simple. Well, for the moment, we're protected. There's not going to be any turmoil. Does anyone think that if this vote was on the euro rather than Italian constitutional reform, this is what it would look like? This is a rhetorical question, as we all know. That's a recovery in the euro today. Does anyone think that's what it would look like if this vote had been on the euro? Say that the vote last night had been Sunday's vote had been, I don't know, about the euro, the referendum on the euro, like Five Star wants to hold. And going into it, it was tied. And then the euro, the stay side, was defeated. And Italians voted to leave there. Does anyone think we'd be anywhere near parity right now? I think we probably would be. So this vote and this recovery is simply because the markets know that nothing's going to be happening immediately. And this is not, by any means, a vote to leave the euro, period, or to leave the European Union. Don't know how that will play out. It will come to be a discussion, but it is not right now. So that's where we get this recovery from. Let's take another look here. This is global equities. You know, you would think, again, same idea, that if the Italians were getting ready to go and blow up the euro, then we would have some pretty serious effects in. Italian is white, the Dow is green. No, the Dow is yellow, I'm sorry. The Nikkei is green. The Shanghai Composite, purple, and the S&P 500 is red. Again, so what we're seeing is that it's simply a sigh of relief. But it was a relief that everybody knew was going to happen because, excuse me, some of the more excitable journalistic references to what could happen here, vote on the euro, you know, is simply nonsense. It's not the way this is going to play out. So what are the possibilities? Let's go over them again so we know. We're going to get a caretaker government in Italy. Sometime, probably my guess, at the next 6 to 9 months, Italy will have an election. Renzi could run. I'm kind of assuming he will, although he said he's finished. My guess is he will. I don't know which candidate would be the supposed, I don't know if Grillo has said that he will serve as prime minister if Five Star wins. I don't know. The Italian system works sort of like the British does. You elect a list of party members, and their party leader becomes the prime minister. And no one knows how this debate will play out. Up until now, the Five Star movement, and you could say the Northern League, although the Northern League has never really been able to move, that should probably be the Northwestern League, has never really been able to move beyond its geographic base in Northwest Italy. The if not everything, certainly many things, rule or party program of Five Star movement will not suffice in a general election. You cannot simply say that we want to put the vote to a referendum without having an opinion on what the terms of the result of the referendum should be. You can't say that we're anti-globalist without making more concrete proposals. You can't say they're anti-establishment without making more concrete proposals. So the opposition will be forced by a national campaign to define and redefine what it is they stand for and what it is they are against. Once that campaign commences, we will have a far better idea and a far more volatile idea. Now, Britain will be probably moving to the Article 50. I think they're going to do it in March. Donald Trump will be president in the United States at that point. So we are not only going to have a potentially difficult and divisive campaign in Italy, but the responses from the other people, and also, you know, after that, of course, France has an election. Germany has election in 2018. Merkel's popularity is much diminished. The French are running two right-wing candidates, basically. A center-rightist and a little further rightist, although I'm not sure that would be Fillon and Marine Le Pen. So there are plenty of things on the horizon, the political horizon, to keep markets boiling and, if you will, markets fearful. But back to the specifics of the likely Italian denouement, which is actually a French word. I think that the markets, and in general, everybody on the financial side, is probably taking comfort this morning from the idea that even if Five Star does win, does move to run, the Italian people are, as I said, against leaving the euro. As I also said, that is a falsely comforting figure. The vote in Italy was not simply a comment on the Italian political establishment. People vote economics very strongly. They vote negative economics, but they also vote positive economics. And this vote is, I would maintain, to a much greater degree than certainly commentators realize, I would even say a much greater degree than the actual voters realize. Because the argument against the euro is, to use a fancy word, inchoate, meaning it's not fully understood or expressed by the people who may actually hold these opinions anyway. The facts of the euro's effect on Italy are rather indisputable. Now, you can claim, which I will not, but you can claim that the growth record of the Italian economy since the advent of the euro is coincidental, meaning the Italian economy hasn't grown, but the reasons are not because of the euro. They simply are tied in time to the advent of the euro. Meaning that if they had never formed the euro, the Italian economy still wouldn't have grown in the past 15 years. I don't know that I buy that. In fact, I know that I don't buy that. But this is the argument that you will have to make in Italy during the next election. Because as I said, the most prominent and most striking and most turmoil-inducing position of the Five Star movement, these people, is putting the referendum to a vote. Well, if they propose a referendum on the euro, does that mean that their position, the movement, the political party as a whole, is agnostic on it? I don't think so. Once the argument begins to be made is when the markets will start to get nervous, depending, of course, on what the polling says. But it is clear, to me at any rate, that there is, aside from, see, again, another parallel with Brexit. Well, maybe we should leave, but the turmoil that it's going to cause will be impossible. I don't think that's true. Same thing here, although maybe a little more so. Britain at least had its own currency. Nothing changed as far as denominations go. But here, I mean, the Italian debt of the past 15 years and everything else is now denominated in euros. If you want to go back to the lira, you have major adjustments to make, shall we say? Not to mention the translation effect. Meaning, how do you decide where to price the lira? Where do you start? One thing it'll be good for, of course, are old currency traders like myself will suddenly be in great demand if not as traders, and I don't think I want to go back to a trading desk, certainly as consultants on what these things mean and how markets work. But the argument against leaving the euro will, I predict, be made largely on the difficulty of leaving grounds rather than the benefits of the euro. I mean, there are two ways to make an argument. It's much like the past presidential race in the United States. The basic argument made by the Clinton side was that Trump was unfit to be president. They didn't talk about his policies, whatever they are, whatever they were. I mean, there were some out there to talk about, but the basic argument they made, and apparently they lost, was that Trump was unfit to be president. Trump made a similar argument about Clinton. So the argument that's going to be made against the euro is the negative argument. It's too difficult to leave. They're not most likely going to make the argument that the euro is good for Italy, because the euro has not been good for Italy. There's no way to make an argument based on economic statistics that the euro has been good for Italy. All you can do is make the counterfactual argument that, well, you know, this would have happened anyway, but you can't prove that. What you can prove is Italian GDP and Italian unemployment since the euro, but especially since the financial crisis. And that argument is not a pro-euro argument. So the sort of the idea that the markets breathed a huge sigh of relief, it will be short-lived. Because Italy will have an election, it must. They're going to form a government. That's the way politics works. The arguments that will be made about the euro, think about who the euro has benefited. By and large, if you're looking for one country, and I'm not pinning a blame, I'm just stating my opinion and facts, I believe it's been beneficial to the Germans. The Germans have their economy exports probably the highest value as a whole, I mean, as a percentage, goods in the world. I think I've mentioned before that until about a year and a half ago, maybe 2 years ago, the value, dollar value of exports from Germany were #1 in the world. Germany's got maybe 80 million people, 78 million people, I forget how many exactly. China has 1.2. It was China with 1.2 million people that took over the #1 spot as far as value of exports. So that tells you about the value of German exports. Well, what do we tend to do with high value items in the consumer economy? We price them at high values. German machine tools are expensive. I have a German sander at home. It's a brilliant piece of machinery. I was so impressed when I bought it. But it's expensive. German cars are expensive. So if Germany and the rest of Europe are still using the national currencies, there is little doubt that the mark, were there a German Deutschmark, would be a far stronger, if not the strongest currency or one of them in the world. What does that mean? Well, that means that for all of Germany's exports, they would be more expensive. So by being in a currency that is tied to many other economies that perform at much lower rates, that are much less efficient, the euro stays lower than a mark would be. So there is a huge benefit to the German economy. This is indisputable. I mean, these are the kinds of facts which are real, and they'll have to be obscured in whatever vote there is in the next national election in Germany. I mean, in Italy. So The arguments that will be made and must be made in the next Italian election are going to be the first time that the economic effects of the euro will be debated in a public forum. This leads to potentially unexpected results. And so when we're contemplating the economic future of Europe, the currency future of Europe, we have to remember this. The euro has been treated by all of its proponents as an immutable fact of nature. It is not. And once that argument starts rolling, I think we'll be available for much more exciting times in markets. Because the notion of joining the euro, and I've spoken about this quite a few times, and the European Union as a whole, are founded in the political realities of the last century. They're founded in the first 50 years of the 20th century. Primarily in the First World War, the Second World War, and if you will, the rise of the Soviet Union and the domination of Eastern Europe by the Soviet Union, but primarily in the two world wars. The purpose of the European Union, and this is the purpose of the euro as well, is to prevent. Now, there are economic reasons behind the euro as well, and there are very good economic reasons behind the European Union, but the political idea is what dominated. The euro was ill prepared. As far as the tactical execution of starting the euro, it was very, very good. As I told you, I was on the trading desk in January 1999 when that started trading, and it went without a hitch. So the preparation, the technicals, but the strategy was difficult. And the concept behind it proves to be economically untrue. The idea that the euro would force convergence of economies and cultures has not been remotely true. The euro, and certainly not in half a generation. The euro did not turn the Greek economy into the German economy. It didn't turn the Italians into the Germans, or the Portuguese into the Finns, or anybody into the Swedes. It didn't happen. The rock that Europe is that the United Europe is in danger of foundering on is one of cultural diversity, surprisingly enough, of cultural loyalty, of national loyalty. It turns out, although this reading is available to anybody who studies history, that nation states, and in many cases much smaller groups, are the largest entities that groups of people feel any loyalty to. And that is an issue for Europe. But back to the euro. So the deep breath that everybody took when they came in this morning on the European trading desks and drove everything right back to the old levels means very little in the next 6 months. Because the economic realities that are behind this vote, and as I said, 60-40 is an absolute runaway in a democracy. Italy's a prosperous country. We're going there. I'm taking my family there this summer. Just so you know, I have quite a few personal connections to Italy because I have family there, and we visit there and they visit here. So I've spent a lot of time in Italy over the past 20, 25 years, both in the north and the south. I used to be fairly fluent in Italian as well. So my understanding of Italy is beyond just the newspapers and articles I read in English. And although, yes, of course, it's generational, as in Britain, older voters tended to vote against Brexit, England has had a reasonable economy. More so since Margaret Thatcher, but very, very successful. Italy has stagnated. I cannot emphasize, especially to my American audience, what the long-term effects of the degree of unemployment in Italy are. If you are looking for a reason for this vote, then look to 12% unemployment. Look to 40% youth unemployment. That's where you should look. And that is an economic reality that is not going to change in the next 6 months. Not only that, it is more than logical to tie the economic performance of Italy to the euro. Italy has lost, I believe, 20% of its manufacturing capacity since the euro arrived 15 years ago. I mean, I have Italian suits, Italian cars, all this stuff. The argument behind this vote has not yet taken place. The argument against the euro has not yet taken place. The proponents, and there will have to be proponents, the five-star movement, when it runs into the next election, is not going to be able to take, as I said, an agnostic point of view on this question. The question of the euro, the question of the EU, and the question of Europe is going to be a question. They're all going to be questions in the next Italian election. It's inevitable. The five-star movement, their electors, their candidates can't say, well, we're going to let you decide, but we have no opinion on the euro. That'll never happen. It can't happen because they can't win an election that way. So this is the beginning of a drama, not by any means the resolution of one. It is interesting, I guess, or certainly, that it's the Italians that are going to be leading this European discussion. For anyone who knows history, perhaps, that is not surprising at all. But it's clearly the case. What the Italians decide to do on this question is actually the future of the euro. Now, you know, I would make the argument that if the Italians decided to stay, the inherent contradictions in the euro will bring this up again. And that's not necessarily true, though. If for some reason this fails, or the Italians do not decide to vote for five-star, and they're continuing muddling through here, unless unemployment and economic growth return, the euro will get the blame. Because imagine this, the argument in the next, say the middle of next year, in the summertime, Italians have an election. The five-star movement makes your argument that the euro is a detriment to the Italian economy, to the Italian economic growth, and to the Italian people. And they lose that election. But the argument will have been made for the first time in a coherent form in the public space. So everybody be aware of it, that this particular movement, which then loses, hypothetically, well, unless the Italian economy starts to recover and employment comes back, then as things continue to deteriorate, assuming they do, the blame has already been established, will have been established. So if any government that comes into Italy, hypothetically, in the middle of next year after the election and say it's not the five-star movement, and if they don't get economic growth and economic improvement, which to my mind will be very difficult since the euro is actually behind us, or behind a good portion of it, then the next election will be even more determinant about what to say about the future of the euro. Okay, folks, to close, do not take the results of this referendum in the markets as a closure on the topics that we've been discussing. The next year or two for the euro are going to be very interesting. Everyone stay tuned. I'm sure we'll be having this same topic discussion in a few months. Anyway, thank you all very much for attending. I appreciate very much taking time out of your day to listen to what I have to say. Any questions or comments, you know the answer. Please send me an email. I will put the email up there, and I'll be glad to respond. Everyone have a great day, and thank you very much for attending.